the idea that the payment happened, that it was corrupt, that it was an effort to interfere with the election, that is quite well established. The idea that the reimbursement was done in a fashion that violated New York law, that's pretty clearly done. Getting Donald Trump's fingerprints on both of those things is going to be the tough part of the case for the prosecution.
Especially because they're such tiny little fingers. Hello and welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Miller. It is Thursday. We're taping this Wednesday afternoon. I'm here with Ben Wittes, who's been in court all week, and right now he's at the Lawfare Hype House, the Lawfare TikTok Hype House in New York City, where everybody's hanging out. He also writes Dog Shirt Daily. He's the editor-in-chief of Lawfare. He does so much. Just one other thing that he does. There's a Lawfare podcast as well, Lawfare Daily. Ben Wittes did kind of a monologue episode on Israel, Gaza, and the implications for the U.S. foreign and domestic policy. That's what it was called. We're not going to talk about that today, but it was awesome. And so if you want to know what does Tim think about this, like basically everything that Ben Wittes said in this podcast is what I think. And so we can just shortchange talking about it right now. And I kind of give you my... What's it called? Proxy. I give you my proxy on this matter. People can go.
That's
check
very
that
kind
out.
of you. It was a speech I gave at Brown University a couple weeks ago, and was something I put a lot of thought into, and people have found it interesting and useful, and I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, it's very nuanced, very thoughtful. You can tell you put time into it. Something you notice about these once you become a podcast man, you can notice when people are winging it. You know,
yes,
I like to.
you
like to think that we're just so talented at this that we can fake it, and maybe I fake a few listeners, but people can notice when you really put time and prepped into it. So it showed in that podcast. So people should go check it out. Okay, where do I want to start here? Before we get into everything, before we get into the case, the merits, the testimony, there's one thing I've just been dying to ask somebody that was in the room. Who is going to give it to me straight. When Stormy was on stage, that's a Freudian slip. When Stormy was on the stand talking about Donald Trump's how just horrific lovemaking and borderline rape, and how his wife doesn't love him, what was it like to just be able to look at Donald Trump's face during that time?
So I was in the overflow room, which is actually good because I could look at his face. Whereas, if you're in the courtroom, you're actually looking at the back of his head. And
the weird kind of hair merging from the 3 hair surgeries.
Exactly.
Comes together in a
and
point.
It has this kind of like, one thing that I'd never really thought about in this trial is that people don't have facial expressions on the back of their head, which, is obvious once you think about it, but you don't.
It's not true for me, actually. I have such a bad poker face that you can even read me from the back of my head. But for most people, that's true.
Right. So Donald Trump, the back of his head is fairly good poker face. I think it looks just like Donald Trump all the time. So I was very interested in his reactions to Stormy Daniels' testimony, which. Mostly, he sat with his eyes kind of gently closed, like this. I don't think he was asleep, by the way, or napping. But I think he was kind of trying to show that it was not getting to him or affecting him. He consulted with counsel, mostly Todd Blanche, who is kind of the Trump whisperer among the group. They all have their very specific jobs, and Blanche's job, I think, is the client management side, which is freaking hard. But mostly, I think he must have either consciously or subconsciously made a decision that he was not going to have kind of demonstrative reactions that would, generate, like Stormy Daniels said X and Trump flinched, or Trump, kind of news stories, because people were really watching him closely. The one thing that the transcript does reflect that he was at some points, and the judge actually called Blanche up and talked to him about this. that he was kind of muttering curses and sort of saying things in an audible fashion. Those were in sidebar conversations with the lawyers that are reflected in the transcript, but I didn't see any of that. So I think he was, unfortunately, because I would love to say to you, and I'd love to see your face when I said this, I would love to say, he was out of control. It really was getting to him. This was, but I don't actually think I can say that in entire truth. The truth is that he was, I think he was pretty much the Donald Trump he would want to be under these circumstances.
Luckily for me, I was going to be happy with whatever answer, because a non-response when someone is talking about how you have no love in your marriage and how you quasi-raped them leads to, kind of a sociopathy that I think I attribute to Donald Trump as well. So, rage, I do whining Donald Trump. I like sociopathic Donald Trump. I also accept. Let's go to bigger picture then. And we kind of go through some of the big marks since we last talked, but you called this on the Substack the case we all deserve. We may have thought we'd have a trial about high politics, about executive power, a great constitutional principle, but we have a trial about something else. So talk to us about how you were trying to frame this up.
Yeah, so I was one of the people I was never one of the people who was dismissive of this case. And I always said, let's wait for the evidence. Let's wait for the legal arguments. Let's wait for the motions to dismiss. But I was one of the people who said this case is objectively less important than the January 6th case. It's objectively less important than the Florida case, which is, busy self-imploding because of the judge. And it's objectively less important than the Georgia case. But what I did not think about in connection with those instincts was that, those are the cases that are really democratically important. But this is the case that's all about us. And why did we, not we as a group of people, but we as a society elect Donald Trump? Because he is a celebrity and we are obsessed with these celebrity culture things. What is this case about? This case is about, self-described alpha males paying off porn stars through these greaseball collections of information brokers. And, that's when you deal with Donald Trump, that's the culture that you're dealing with. And we allowed that to infect the presidency, to overtake the presidency, for the presidency to become a creature of that culture in a fashion that, we should have occasion to reflect on. And I do think this case is an occasion to reflect on that. How many steps from the presidency should David Pecker be? What are the circumstances?
At least 7.
Right, like a lot. How many? But he was none, right? He was in the White House, right? What are the circumstances in which presidents should be signing reimbursement checks for their fixers to pay off their porn stars in the White House? Right? Like, and I actually, the more I watch the case,
and Spiro Agnew got the boot,
right? The more I watch the case, the more I think, okay, is this the case I want? No. Is this the case I think it reflects the highest and most important questions that the Donald Trump presidency raised? No. Is this the case we freaking deserve because we asked for a presidency that was like the dirty.com presidency? And so we got it. And now we have a case about the dirty.com and the National Enquirer and, a bunch of other publications that I've never heard of. Yeah, we deserve this.
Yeah, we're aligned on this. Obviously, I don't think it's as important as his attempted coup, I wasn't that thrilled about this case to begin with. But we deserve it. He deserves it. And sorry, okay, maybe should, in our grand battle to defeat Donald Trump, should he go down because he lied about his reimbursement checks to his fixer about the rapey, hotel room encounter with Stormy Daniels? Like, no, I wish it was on something that had a little bit more substance, but it is what it is. He did that, and it seems to me like he's on track to conviction, which leads me to my next question. Is he on track to conviction? I mean, you can't get inside of the jurors' heads, but I mean, as you assess these testimonies, maybe a better way to ask that question is, over the past few days, has it seemed to you more likely that we're heading towards a conviction? And if so, which testimonies were the ones that you think were the most powerful in that regard?
Well, so the critical testimonies are neither Stormy Daniels nor Hope Hicks. Those are the ones that generated all the headlines, and rightly so. I actually found Stormy Daniels' testimony really moving and upsetting for a lot of reasons. And Hope Hicks's testimony.
Thank you for saying that. Actually, let's just pause on that, because I had a disagreement yesterday with Sarah. I hate disagreeing with Sarah. But on the Next Level podcast, I had a disagreement with Sarah, who I think I totally get. This isn't even a critique of her, but like, she felt a little icky about the Stormy stuff, and the Stormy stuff is leaking out, and I think maybe I read more of the transcript, and because I also felt moved by it. I think she was put in a horrific situation, and has not maybe acted perfectly over the past 5 years. Who has 8 years in the ways in which she talked about Donald Trump, but like, I mean, she was asked pressured to essentially accuse him of rape, like Gloria Allred, in a situation that was rape adjacent, and she declined to do that because she felt like it was consensual. And like, again, I wasn't there, so you listening to it, talk about what I was just sort of moved by the transcript of her discussing that encounter and how gross it was and how challenging it was for her. But was that what you were referencing, or was there something
Yeah,
else?
Principally. I also think this is a person who's had a very difficult life and has been manipulated by people who some of them had fiduciary obligations to her, particularly Michael Avenatti, who got her in an enormous amount of trouble and are, by the way, now in prison for it, right? I mean, this is a person who's been quite exploited, and by a number of people, including but not limited to Donald Trump. And this is not a person who, at least by her testimony, went out seeking a relationship with Donald Trump. She was seeking to be, if you believe her story, to avoid a dinner with people that she didn't want to see, and to maybe get on The Apprentice. She finds herself in a situation that maybe she should have avoided, but that's actually not how we judge people. And then has had her life kind of dominated by it ever since, in this way that sometimes she has handled effectively, and sometimes she's handled less than entirely honorably, frankly. She's definitely told different things to different people at different times, and asked for money for the story to be true or not true. Or on the other hand, this is somebody who had the power of a lot of celebrity culture, including the celebrity culture dominated presidency, arrayed against her, and powerful people who wanted to destroy her, one of whom she was sitting across from the other day. And I have to say, I looked at that, just at, like, leave aside the case for a minute.
Yeah.
I think she is more sinned against than sinning, and is among the group of people that are among the high profile group of people whose conduct is at issue in this case. I would much rather have a beer with her than anybody else. I'd much rather, like invite her to my house for for dinner than David Pecker.
Or
than her lawyer, Keith Davidson, or than her lawyer, Michael Avenatti, or than her, this is not a person. And like, she has to obviously take some responsibility for some of her choices in life, which have not been ideal, like associating with those people and doing business with those people. But I do think at the end of the day, this is not a person who, when I'm watching her testify about what happened between her and Donald Trump, I don't have any doubt about like who the good guy in that story is.
No, we are Team Stormy on this podcast, just like we were Team Monica. We talked about that a while back. Anyway, I derailed us to that, but I think that's important. And I was interested to hear your first person account of that. But back to where you were going, which is which of the testimonies, we'll end with Hope Hicks, but which were the other testimonies that you thought were the most powerful, at least with regards to
the most important testimony of the week is the one that people talk about the least. And it is the testimony of the controller of the Trump organization, a guy named Jeff McConney, who basically, the story in this case has two halves, right? There's the story about paying off Stormy Daniels and paying off Karen McDougal, the catch and kill story. And then there's the story that's the actual crime, which is the falsification of business records by way of covering that up. Jeff McConney delivers almost the entirety of the second half of the story. He does it as a Trump loyalist. He worked for the Trump organization basically his whole career. He seems to have no animus against Donald Trump, seems to be fond of him. And he lays out from beginning to end how they set up a system to reimburse Michael Cohen for this set of transaction, or for the transaction with Stormy Daniels and with a bunch of other stuff. And he does it in a fashion that the defense really did not lay a glove on in cross-examination, didn't even really try. And there is just no way you can come away with that testimony with the sense that the accounting of this matter on the part of the Trump organization was on the up and up, right? You can talk about, well, did Trump know that Alan Weisselberg had directed him to do this? Who knew what? I suppose you can argue about that, but that there was a reimbursement scheme with respect to Cohen vis-a-vis the payments to Stormy Daniels, the payment to Stormy Daniels is simply not a matter of reasonable dispute. And I would be shocked if the jury had not internalized that as a result of both his testimony and the testimony that immediately followed him, the accounts payable woman at Trump Tower, whose name is Deborah Tarasoff, who had the great line, asked to explain the difference between accounts payable and accounts receivable. She said, accounts receivable, it's someone owes you money, you get it, it's coming in. Accounts payable, they send you a bill, you send the money out. That's the Trump organization accounting practices.
Great. You mentioned something during that about the poor cross here. I asked you last week what the Trump defense was at this point. You gave an answer. I'm still not sure I understand it. So now we have another week's worth of cross examinations. What kind of defense do you think that they're building at this point?
All right. So first of all, I want to say that 12 hours after we had that conversation, the defense cross-examination of Keith Davidson happened. The lawyer who I described as, hey, he's not nearly as sleazy as I thought he was going to be, right? He seems like just a lawyer. Whoa, was I wrong? So this is why you never talk about somebody before the cross-examination is done. I screwed up. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. This guy is an unbelievable scumbag. And so bracket that. Look, the defense
you believe in the goodness of people.
I believe, somebody sits on the stand, takes the oath, and says things, and I'm like, okay, they seems like a good guy.
We need to have some of us to deal a little bit more in the scummy side of society there with you, behind your shoulder, being like, Wittes, I don't know about this. Actually, this guy reminds me of. Anyway, all right, so we'll set that aside. Go ahead, continue.
So Keith Davidson. The defense is still the same. The defense is kind of has three prongs. One is Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen, that this was an extortion scheme by Stormy Daniels, not an election interference matter. But if it was an election interference matter, what's wrong with that? That's called democracy. We all NDAs are perfectly legal. There's no problem there if it was. And by the way, it was, Melania would have been very hurt.
Yeah. Was any progress made in the cross of Stormy on that prong of the defense?
The cross of Stormy has only really begun. It was, went on for a couple hours on Tuesday. It will, I think, take up most of the day today. So that's the first prong of the defense. And, they've made I don't think they've made a lot of headway in that, but they definitely got David Pecker to admit some things. They got Keith Davidson to admit a lot of things, including that he, was responsible for the Hulk Hogan sex tape and, basically every sex tape you've ever heard of that's ever been made public. He's behind it.
Not a big sex tape man. I hope Keith Davidson better not have been behind that leak that targeted poor Jamal Murray. Don't Google that. It
didn't show up in the discussion. I just want to say, but if don't bet against Keith Davidson being involved. If there's a sex tape, he's probably made some money from it. A $2 million payout from Charlie Sheen.
Yeah.
That he doesn't remember. I mean, the guy's a piece of work. They've done a pretty good job at setting up Trump was being extorted by some nasty people. There's other arguments too. The second half of the second component is the idea that Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels are people you shouldn't believe. Right. That's the main thing they're trying to get from this cross. And
the problem with that is that they haven't settled on you shouldn't believe them because I didn't do it, or you shouldn't believe it because I did do it, but their story is lies about this, that, or the other.
Correct. Right? And also, I mean, they're throwing a lot of spaghetti at the wall, and it doesn't have the same piece of spaghetti doesn't have to stick for each juror.
Got it.
Right. They only need one juror.
Yeah, right. Got it. Fair.
And so the third component, which is the one that I think the accountants really took apart, is the idea that this was just sometimes a payment for legal services is just a payment for legal services. Michael Cohen was the president's personal lawyer. He's not. And I think it is very difficult to listen to these two, one accounts payable woman and one controller, and come away from it not thinking, oh, there was a scheme here to pay him back, pay Michael Cohen back $420,000 and spread it out over a year and disguise it as legal fees. And so I think to the extent that they're relying on that third component of the defense, I think got damaged this week.
Yeah. All right. Closing out with Hope Hicks. She cried, I guess.
She did cry.
Why? I couldn't get good context from these stories. Was she crying because she still loves Donald Trump and she feels like she's betraying him, or because just the stress of the situation and the memories, or what's happening?
It was genuinely unclear to me. It happened right after the direct examination had ended. The cross-examination starts, and she's asked a perfectly pedestrian set of questions, and she goes to pieces. So it's clearly more about what happened at the end of the direct examination than what happened at the beginning of the cross, which was friendly. I think the answer is, I'm not sure about this, that she found very upsetting the last line of questioning. And I got to say, thinking about it afterwards, I understand why she would find it upsetting. It's not a betrayal of Trump, but it's an extremely unflattering piece of information that she gave up. And that was that in 2018 in the White House, he says to her, Michael Cohen, first of all, acknowledges that Michael Cohen gave this payment, says to her that he did it out of the goodness of his heart, that it wasn't, he wasn't directed to, he just did it on his own. And that Trump regarded it as a real show of loyalty and something that he was meaningful to him. So that was the first thing. So revealing that he, in fact, knew that it was that Cohen had done this, at least in 2018. The second component of that conversation is that he says, and this is, I think, the part that is just, no single piece of information is going to decide this case, but this is an important piece of information. He says, I'm glad he did it because I'd rather be dealing with this now, meaning in the White House, now here, than in November and October of 2016. And so he basically says, and she's real clear about this, and she's looking right at him when she says it. And that's the election interference component of it, right? We successfully
Just to be clear for people trying to understand that. So we're in 2018 at this point.
In the White House.
In the White House.
2018.
He's already won. And he's saying, I'm glad we're dealing with this now, not in October of 2016, right before the election.
Right. In other words,
it could have damaged me.
Yeah. Michael Cohen did this. He claims, even in this conversation, not at my direction, on his own, out of the goodness of his heart, however much goodness there may be in his heart. He did this, and I am glad he did it, and I'm glad he did it because we're dealing with this now having won rather than this having affected the outcome of the election. And so if you think about whenever you listen to testimony in a criminal case, you never listen to the testimony itself alone. You should always have in your head the way the prosecutor or the defense lawyer is going to talk about that testimony in closing arguments, right?
Yeah.
And so here, you're going to say, this is Donald Trump admitting to his most trusted communications aide that this was an election interference effort. It was intended that way. And in his judgment, it worked and it was successful. And I think that's the significance of Hope Hicks's testimony. And she does that. The prosecution turns her over to the defense. He asks her a perfectly pedestrian question, and she went to pieces.
Yeah. I can't say I feel a lot of empathy for Hope. Okay.
Empathy doesn't enter into it.
Tough titties, Hope Hicks.
But wait, can I just say that there is like one empathy issue with respect to Hope that you should think about, which is that the jury is going to find her a very appealing witness. Yeah. She is, none of the reasons that you, and for that matter, I would say a thing like, I'm not going to spend any time having empathy for Hope Hicks, none of that is on display in the court. She comes in, she's extremely polished. She's in all the ways that we know Hope Hicks to be polished, right? She's very communicative with both the defense and the prosecution. She's not belligerent. She's a good witness. And so you say, if you're a minimally involved person who has only a limited sense of all this, which is what you have to be in order to be a juror in this case, and you see Hope Hicks saying that, your empathy is not where Tim Miller's empathy is here. And that this is a very appealing person on her face.
Yeah. Okay. Finally, just briefly, the versus what your perception was of the likelihood that a guilty verdict is rendered at the beginning of the trial versus right now. Do you feel about the same, more likely, less likely? I mean, obviously you can't get in the head of these jurors, but just your impressions.
I always thought the case was likely to be pretty strong. So I'm not super surprised at its strength. There are areas where it's stronger than I expected it to be, particularly in the forensics area. The accounting forensics are really, really bad for Trump. And there are also areas that I still actually think we need to learn something from the rest of the case. And so the areas that the case is weakest so far are on Trump's personal direction of either side of the stories, either his personal direction to Cohen to make this payment, or his personal direction to Alan Weisselberg to reimburse the payment. And I think the case will, the idea that the payment happened, that it was corrupt, that it was an effort to interfere with the election, that is quite well established. The idea that the reimbursement was done in a fashion that violated New York law, that's pretty clearly done. Getting Donald Trump's fingerprints on both of those things is going to be the tough part of the case for the prosecution.
Especially because they're such tiny little fingers. Okay, Ben Wittes, thank you so much for coming back on the Bulwark Podcast.
Anytime, man.
Wittes is our man in Amsterdam, our man at the Trump trial. We'll be having him back here again soon. Make sure to go check out that Lawfare podcast. I'll put it in the show notes.